As an artist who shows work in galleries and a filmmaker, I wondered kind of where does your work live for you? You know, your films are mostly viewable online as well, and you show in film festivals. Yeah, where does the work, what's the optimal viewing conditions, and how much does it matter?
I mean, I think that it matters a lot, but also not at all, you know? Like, when I first started making films, there's like an experimental cinema context, you know, like the cinema space is very important, very sacred, and just the time that you spend together alone in a dark room and looking at the big screen is special. And the things that you could do with sound and image and, you know, like, all that stuff, you know, it adds to the experience. But over the years, I mean, where I've had the opportunity to see my works in galleries or on monitors or projected on a wall, it also offers a different way of experiencing the work. I mean, some of the challenging things about a cinema or just seeing something in a cinema is that you can only see it once, or maybe it's in an experimental film festival and it's playing in a program that's 2 hours long on Friday afternoon, you know? And that's great. Like, I mean, I love those experiences also, but it's also who has access to them, and you know, who can come to these festivals, and if they're worried about premiere, etc. And so, I mean, something about the gallery space too is people can come and visit and cycle through for a month or 2 months or however long. And similar ways with things online. I mean, I think I've always kind of pushed against the sort of online exclusivity, or just that things aren't available online, you have to go through a distributor, you have to go through XYZ in order to see something. And it was after the pandemic where I think I made most all of my video work available to watch on my Vimeo page. I mean, as a way to share the work and as a way to let a viewer decide what sort of time they want to spend with it. And hopefully it's with headphones, you know, and hopefully it's in a dark room. But if it's on their phone, on the bus, that's cool too, you know?
I mean, I think so much about time and tense in your work, like this present tenseness of film, how, you know, this motif of the road, which comes back again and again in your work, and is a perfect metaphor for this feeling of things passing, trying to kind of grasp them, retain them as they pass, and at the same time, always looking ahead to what's around the corner. So, you know, we sort of have the memory of what's just gone as the next thing comes. And the reason I think about that with your work is that because it is so heavy with atmospherics and sound, layers of vision and sound and meaning and reference, things that slip past us perhaps we haven't quite caught. A lot of my sense is of something constantly slipping through my hands. I wondered, like, how you think about tense and time. And another related question is, how much are these films kind of repositories of memory, of things that are past, and how much are they experiential, you know, atmospheric evocations that we experience moment to moment, and how much are they something maybe more speculative? You know, you're inventing a reality that doesn't exist.
I mean, all of those things, especially from piece to piece. I mean, even like watching them tonight, you know, I think I like the word repository because that's how it feels sometimes. I mean, like the film lore, I remember while making it, you know, with my friends and just in that space, knowing that we were like going our own separate ways after that, you know, we were all living together in Cambridge. And the friendship that was there was really important. And I remember while making this film, like, how am I, like, knowing that I'm going to feel nostalgic for it in a few years, in 4 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, and anticipating that sort of changing relationship to it, and the process of creating an archive of sorts. And a film like Kicking the Clouds, where it's all things that I shot, you know, in the spring and summer of 2021 on a 16mm camera, and at the same time trying to document my family while revisiting another archival aspect of our family's own lore, which is this sort of a tape that's, you know, I mean, my mom told me about in February of 2021, and it's just of my grandmother and great-grandmother having a language lesson in 1970, 71, and that being a sort of archival object, and how can I use my process and practice as a filmmaker, shooting these things, editing things, doing this interview as a way to be in communication with that archive or with that history in ways that are also about generating new ideas or generating new sort of feelings that is very much in the present tense, not so much in a nostalgic sort of way of looking at how things used to be, or while there's a sense of loss and mourning in the work, I mean, it's also in some ways celebratory as well. Like, I mean, even just like the film When You're Lost in the Rain, that's the title of it. It's just like, you know, including my dad's voicemails to me, you know, my birthday in there, it was just like, I did it after he died, and it's just like, it's a ways that I can listen to them again, you know? And it's hard, you know? But it's also just like, how can these things exist in a way, how can these recordings, my dad singing me birthday songs in a voicemail, exist in communication with the content of the film itself, you know? And sort of freeing it from this sort of relegation to just being an archival memory of mine, you know? And how can that activation of his voice, which is now gone, be in conversation, which these things I'm thinking through, be part of a conversation that continues?
Yeah, there's a kind of loosening of things from their original context. You know, there's a amazing moment in that film, the first time I watched it, where your mother, in Kicking the Clouds, I mean, where your mum, I think she addresses you. She says something like, your father, and suddenly, you know, it all clicks into focus and we realize what we're listening to. But up until that point, it was somewhat abstract. And, you know, we had no way of knowing that was your father in that film. The entire thing changes. But yeah, I appreciate the way some of the source material is abstracted or de-anchored from where it came from. There's this central question about interpretation and reference and getting it and not getting it. And there was this fantastic piece in Art Forum that Julia Julia Pelter-Feldman wrote, where she talks about the legibility, and use this quote from you, I think, where you say it's empowering to realize you don't have to make films for a white audience and consider or not whether they understand the cultural references. Beyond the question of who your audience is, a filmmaker, I imagine, always has that of embedded meaning in a project. But it's even more vital for you, knowing that there were some people who will immediately get, and it may be your family, it may not be just your broader community, who immediately get references. How do you think about that kind of going forward? Is that something that's growing in importance, that sort of hidden quality or illegibility?
I mean, it's like who is it illegible to, you know? Like, it's a I didn't want to bring it up, but there was this like hyperallergic like interview that I did, and I had this really nice conversation with the person doing the interview, and it was about the sort of idea of legibility and access and burdening the work from having to teach and explain. And the headline was, Sky Hopinka is tired of teaching white people about Native Americans, you know? And I was just like, fuck, that's not what I said, you know? It's like, I mean, it's just like the whole thing I think about that is I'm burdening the work from having to do that. Like the film itself, like I can make, you know, Kicking the Clouds, and there's so many different references in terms of my family and my hometown and Lisenio and diaspora, and it's all present, it's all there. Like, I mean, this idea of like, you know, understanding, like revealing like who that this person is my mother, you know? It's like, while I'm making it, I already know it's my mom, you know, obviously. But it's just like, that isn't my concern to sort of reveal. It's more just like, what are the emotional tenors that I'm interested in exploring through the sort of like progression of this tape and the introduction of it. And the other part of it, it's secondary, it's tertiary, you know? It's like a second order sort of like relationship that an audience might get from the sort of time that I spend with the people that I'm talking to and want to be talking to through the work. And I think that's like what I mean by sort of that unburdening of the sort of labor of the work of having to teach and explain, where I don't want to have to give like, you know, 4 or 5 title cards in the beginning explaining all of this sort of historical significance, the facts, who the family is, and rather I just want those connections to be felt through the care and the treatments of the image, of the sounds, of the edits. And it's through that, this idea that, you know, you can listen in and watch in on me talking to my mom, you know, but we're not gonna you know, stop and explain to you what we're talking about, you know? It's just like it's then on you as the viewer to then do some of that labor and some of that work to then meet us where we're at. And even if you don't understand the things that we're talking about or what we're relating to, hopefully the care and the work offers a way for an audience, for you, for whoever, to get some sense of connection to the emotional registers that we're working through and draw from your own experiences and how they apply to you. And your own sort of historical sort of like relationship to this country or to colonization or to family or to loss and mourning, you know, because it's just like, it's like opening up more connecting points rather than limiting them to the purely historical or factual.
Yeah, I mean, you do a lot of work that allows us to let go of those questions. You know, there's plenty of points that I should ask Sky who Adrian is. And then it's like,
You can ask me.
Sorry?
You can ask me.
Well, no.
It's why we do Q&As, you know?
My point is that seems like the least interesting thing to ask. And the success of the films is you're kind of swept along, that's you don't get hung up on those issues. I mean, connected to this is an idea of place, you know, the place, specifics of place or placelessness that we feel in the films. That I can, you know, there's some places that I can identify. There's some places that I absolutely can't. There's some places that nobody except you could, you know, if we're looking at the ocean or something. And then there's, you know, I think of the shots out of the airplane window, which are pictures of placelessness. You know, that's a picture of no place. How do you think about place in relation to each film? I mean, I saw at the end of Sunflower Siege Engine, it's filmed in, it says the East-West and
Cahokia.
Cahokia, yeah, where the mounds are. Yeah, is each film attached to a place, or is it free from that?
I mean, it changes from piece to piece. Like, I mean, in some ways, that's like why some of these formal strategies that I use are kind of, can be anchors in some sort of way, whether it's like text in the middle of the screen, me doing a voiceover, or music, you know? It's like, especially the work the last 3 or 4 years, having those sort of like grounding points where it's just like, text can offer a different anchoring point for the viewer as the image explores these different sort of locations or moves through them. So a piece like When You're Lost in the Rain is very much about transience and moving through these different sort of locations, or this idea of the West, you know, per, you know, Western romanticized ideas of it, you know, for Walt Whitman, you know, pioneers. And, you know, a lot of it was like taken on a train trip that I took from Chicago down to LA, and just like was in the Southwest, had my camera pointed out the window. And so it became about that sort of untethering of a specific location and more about like movement and sort of the broader ideas of manifest destiny, and also just the resistance to that by people that are affected by the diaspora, like Jordan, as, you know, she questions where she is as a Native person in these different homelands that aren't her own, which is things that I do also. And with Sunflower Siege Engine, I mean that's like me working through issues of NAGPRA, sovereignty, and my own place as a Native person living in 2023, you know, 2022, 24, you know, and just like how those different sort of temporal relationships can intersect, whether it's the ancestors that haven't been repatriated, that are prisoners in these museums, that are locked up, and to these sort of like resistance movements like Alcatraz, you know, and just like the sort of history of Native people as incarcerated people in this country. Before we were Americans, we were prisoners, you know? And that's just like, that's something that still hangs heavy in how we exist today. And it's just like our ancestors are still prisoners in these museums, you know? And like how then do we carry that weight as we move through this world, you know, in a contemporary setting, in the everyday sort of way that we live, you know? And I think that's like what the text and the voice is sort of reflecting on. It's just this sort of like idea of moving and aging, but then also like being present or trying to be present in this sort of like different sort of very physical, tactile, and also like embodied locations.
Yeah.
And Cahokia is very much like a place around that too, you know, with just like this mountain city that is such an important place for my tribe and our ancestors, but then is also like, you know, in some ways a celebration of them.
I mean, and in some senses, the importance of place is offset by the importance of, or the freedom of travel as well, right? Like that, as I understand it, you, as a young person or as a kid, you traveled around a lot to powwows and so on. We see the road again and again. You, as I don't know you well, but it seems like you've lived in different places in your adult life, that you're not, you didn't grow up on a reservation, is that correct? So my impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you have a fairly fluid relation to belonging. Is that a burden, or is that a freedom that you value?
I mean, I feel pretty good about it. Well, I mean, it's just like, you know, like, I mean, yeah, I grew up in a small town called Ferndale, which is like right next to the Lummi Reservation. And my tribes are from Southern California and from Wisconsin. Oh yeah. And my, you know, my cousins, my aunties, you know, they're Lummi. And so it's just like, there's always proximity. And, you know, like I have like talked about before, it's just this idea of like, you know, growing up in Ferndale, being around family that are Lummi, but I'm not, like that was my first introduction of, you know, things that I don't have access to culturally because I'm not of a certain tribe, you know, and it's just like, it's an important lesson to learn, or just this idea of like what it means to be guests on different homelands. And even like moving to California when I was 12 and, you know, just like being closer to my mom's homelands, but still just this idea of like different location or how that is defined and how that can define you, or how that is a definition that has been imposed upon us in terms of very static locations by the government. And it's just like, you know, whenever I'd move around from like, you know, Ferndale, California, Portland, Wisconsin, you know, just so I was looking for like the natives, you know, it's just like that's the place where you seek refuge as you move through these different sort of locations. And there is a sort of like idea of like the native hub, you know, that is like, you know, wherever natives go, like they find each other, and that's how like these cultures support and thrive despite relocation efforts by the government.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about this, the powwow tradition? It's something, I mean, not everyone may know, or I didn't know until recently, was that powwows are sort of intended for a white audience in part as well. No? No.
Continue.
Correct me if I... So as I understood it, they were sort of for tourists done on reservations. Is that correct? So a lot of the time people are dancing for white people. No?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
It's like, you know, it started out as, you know, like Wild West shows, you know, just like, you know, drawing from some rodeo traditions and also like, you know, different sort of woodland prairie traditions and like different dances. They are often, you know, designed to, or had been traditionally or like historically, to draw people to reservations as a way to bring some sort of economy to these places because they're very impoverished to the government, you know, due to the reservation system. And they, I mean, I wouldn't say it's like, you know, one thing or another, but rather it's also ways for Native people to practice being together in ways that's deemed safe, acceptable by the government. I mean, you have to remember, like, I mean, you know, we weren't free to practice our own religion until the 70s, to engage in like language revitalization until the 90s, you know? I mean, it's just, these are things that people forget about, and like how it really hasn't been okay to be a Native person, an Indian, a Ho-Chunk person, whatever, in this country up until pretty recently, you know? And it's like these are often ways for people to gather in safety and to be together. And maybe sometimes like sort of tourist aspect is like a sort of smokescreen in order just to like, you know, be together. And it's just like a long evolving tradition that I think is really beautiful, and it's really complicated in a lot of different ways. I mean, there's powwows all over the country, you know, but each one is different. You know, it's like there's some like loose definitions of this happens and this happens and this happens, but people practice their own different ideas around these traditions, you know, and you know, some people view them in a lot of different ways, and I think that that's like a very powerful reflection of the sort of neocultural practice and power of Native peoples trying to survive and stay alive and to still like maintain their sense of identity and culture. And so it's like, I mean, they can be flattening in a lot of different ways, or pan-indigenous in a lot of different ways, but like I said, often they give kind of enough breathing room to like, you know, oh, look over here as we go do our thing over here, you know?
Right, right. Are they, is that tradition evolving with time? I mean, you know, like where are those native hubs typically for you now? I mean, do you still go to powwows? Do you still dance?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't really danced since before the pandemic, and it's also like, I mean, my grandma passed away, and I think I'm using this new film, The Powwow People, as a way to kind of, I don't know, ease back into it, you know? And it's just like they are constantly evolving and changing, you know? Like, I mean, it's just like there's a lot of questions that pop up during powwows that are reflective of conversations right now, you know, around gender, around being two-spirit, around different sort of ways, you know, of what are the things that we want to do when we talk about decolonization, you know? And different sort of values, cultural beliefs, and practices. And I mean, it's just like, that's what I really love about it, is just like, you know, there is like no essentialized idea of what these things are. And also just like pushing it back against, like, what are the ideas when non-natives think about the spectacle of the powwow, you know? Is it fry bread? Is it, you know, Saturday night dancing? Is it fancy dancers, you know? Is it drum groups? You know, it's just like there's so many different elements that go into it, and what lies beneath or around or adjacent to the sort of spectacular surface that most people recognize when they think of them, when they've heard of them.
This might be a good moment to mention that Sky's working on a feature-length project called Powwow People. Could you tell us a bit about this? I mean, you haven't started production yet, right?
Actually, just did my first interview last week in Oklahoma. But the film is essentially, it's revolving around 4 or 5 interviews with different sort of people at the powwow. And what we're doing is we're putting on a powwow in Seattle, and it's going to be a powwow that we film. So, I mean, just a lot of questions, you know, like, I mean, like I remember like being a kid going to powwows, and it's the first time, like, you know, I ever hear anyone talk about this idea of consent when being photographed. You know, you have the MC, you know, telling all the tourists, all the white people, like, you know, don't take pictures unless you ask, you know, and you know, just this idea that too, you can ask someone for $5 if they want to take your picture, you know, and it's just like that sort of agency in your image and how it's presented is something that I learned at a very early age, and so it's just there's agency in the performer at the powwow, of the dancer, the drummer, or the participant, or whoever. You know, it isn't just like a zoo for white people to come and take pictures, you know, but it's just like, how can powwow people be responsible and in charge and have say in their image and how they're presented? And so like that was like kind of what led us to want to put on our own powwow. I mean, I think I put on my first powwow in like 2006 or 7, and so it's just like been fun, like working with people that I used to organize powwows with again as we do this project, and invite people to come dance, drummers to come sing, with this idea that this is a powwow to be filmed. And so there's already like an opt-in or opt-out in terms of that conversation that's being activated, and also just the process of making the film and filming the powwow that we organize is inevitably going to be part of the film itself. So I mean, it's daunting, but it's exciting.
You put on powwows yourself. Is this a common thing that people do their own powwows? I assumed that it was sort of something that was established and traditional within the community.
Yeah, I mean, like being part of like, you know, Native student groups in college, you know, and it's just like, put it on the annual powwow. And then my mom, like, she organized powwows too. And so I remember, like, hanging out with her when she would do that. And so I think it was just like part of like family's engagement with that. And yeah, I mean, I remember one thing my mom said, when I was putting on my first powwow and like worried if anyone's gonna come, she says, all you need for a powwow is a dancer and a drum, and you got a powwow. And it's just like that kind of like really stuck with me. There's this idea that these can take shape in many different forms. They can be big contest powwows, they can be small traditional powwows, they can be gatherings that, a community organized to practice on a Thursday night, So it's like they can exist in many different shapes and forms.
Is there any analog between the performativity of that kind of event and the way performativity happens in your films, in these films? I mean, I'm thinking about your voice. We see musicians in one film. There's obviously performed music. I mean, is it a stretch to say that there's something of that performance? Actually, the other aspect to this that I was thinking of is that a performance can be for the participants, like for the dancers, and I get that sense quite strongly in some of the films too, that this is something that's happening amongst the people we're watching.
Yeah, one of my favorite times at a powwow is like a Saturday night around midnight, Maybe like the last few categories are finishing up, but the tourists have all long left, the spectators have left, and it's just like the powwow people hanging out, Kids running around the bleachers, like dancers like with half their outfits off or regalia off, just like visiting, talking shit, joking, singing, smoking cigarettes, whatever, and just like the drummers are still drumming, the dancers are still dancing, and it's just like, it's very much for the people there at that moment. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think with the films too, like, this idea of performance. Actually, there's a quote that I read. It's like in this, I think, movement research about dance. But in this, they said that the attention is the medium of performance. And that's really stuck with me because I think about that a lot with these films, or just what are you paying attention to and how can I guide your attention towards something? And then what does that do for the time you spend looking at something, whether it's durational or quick or in a sonic sort of scape or where things are legible or not, And how much is the attention part of the thing that I'm trying to make you think about, whether it's something that you don't like or you get uncomfortable with, like, God, is this cut ever going to end? And it's just like how that sort of like, those negative feelings are actually generative as well when it comes to engaging with something that is unfamiliar or something that is challenging in whatever sort of realm or way.
Yeah, I always think of it as such a generous exchange, that thing with performer and audience, the civility that the audience gives you guys are now to the people on stage, and the work that the performers do to keep people's attention. It always touches me. It's, like you go into a bar and there's a kind of bad band on stage, but people listen and give them the benefit of the doubt. Before we turn questions over to the audience, I have to ask you about writing and how writing figures in your day-to-day practice, and how it shapes the films. I understand you write poetry outside of the film work. Is that right?
I think I'm hesitant to call them poems out of respect for poets, Sure. Or like a day-to-day practice seems like really burdensome. Maybe it's like month to month or maybe like quarterly. Like where, I don't know, it's like, you get into these different modes of like, I'm going to shoot for like 2 months and just like gather a lot of footage. Or just like, I really got like these things in my mind in terms of words and phrases and the way that the words sound together. And so I'm going to focus on writing for a few weeks. And maybe I'll just sit on that for like 4 or 5 months until it finds its way into a work. And I think like some of the works screened tonight are examples of that. Like Mnemonics of Shape and Reason is the first piece, and then Kicking the Clouds draws from the same text that the title comes from, and some of the text in there. Same thing with Sunflower Siege Engine, and Lore itself is a film that is based around a collection of poems called Perfidia, and just like that kind of like spirals or what's the word? Things like branch out.
Generates other...
There's a better word for it.
Spawns?
Spawn? Yeah.
It's a bit sci-fi.
Spores, maybe, no. Germinates.
That's a good one. That's a nice organic.
Yeah.
Like that.
That is just kind of like, yeah, it's just like how can, like, not one thing define an idea, whether it's a poem, a film, a series of photographs, but how can they be complementary to each other and complicate the different ideas that are present in whether it's a piece of writing or a film, and how that becomes part of like a body or collection of different ways of looking at a text or an image or an idea about NAGPRO or something.
So does it usually happen that the text comes first when you're making a film? I mean, I was wondering how much of the film is sort of projective, like you have an idea and you need to gather things that fit into that idea, and how much it is assembling things that already exist. Like you shoot a lot and you write things in your notepad and you move them around in that sort of collagist way.
I mean, it changes from project to project. I mean, I've found, like, there's no right way to make a film, you know? I mean, there's different ways of, like, I think just like really getting comfortable with my practice and knowing that, you know, sometimes I don't really know what I'm thinking about something until after it's done, or at least maybe in that first round of edits, or just like, right, these are how these things kind of fit, or just like having pools of things to work with and draw from, and then I might add to it more writing as the project develops or continues. Or just like, I mean, with this feature, like I'm doing a lot of shooting and planning before I'm even gonna start editing it. So it's just like different modes for different sort of ways of making work. I think the more experimental stuff, I think I'm very much guided by intuition when it comes to just seeing how things fit together and then sussing out where that intuition comes from, or questioning why did I make those choices, or what do these things mean to me in conversation with one another.
I imagine it's a totally different process with a feature film. What draws you to that format? What can you do in a feature that you can't do in it's a stupid question, but you know, like in a 10-minute film, what do you enjoy? How do you spread your wings when it's a 90-minute, more documentary style film?
I don't know. I mean, I think like it's just part of that challenge of just like, you know, spending more time with an idea. My first feature, Mothny, was very much me just seeing how does my short filmmaking practice scale up into something longer. And these next few projects I'm working on that are features are now how then can I, now that I know what it's like to make a feature-length film, how then can I further challenge myself to, I don't know, plan things out more, work with a team, work up with a budget, you know, and see what sort of things develop after having done that. So it's a constant sort of ways of trying to learn something new or a different way of working with moving image.
When do you hope for Power People to be done? When are we going to see that?
2023, 4? 4
seems... It's very exciting. Does anyone here have questions? There's a microphone. Oh, look, there's somebody already. You wait for the mic. Thanks.
It's not a question, but it's more of I think a lot of the things you said right now were really powerful, and I really appreciated that to begin with. So I want to start with that. But I know one of the things you were mentioning right now during the QA was I think you were saying that you just want people to really, I guess, enjoy the cinema that, you know, you just made essentially. And I want to say that when I was watching your film right now, it definitely took me back to a place of joy. And I really enjoyed it, especially with the choice of cinematography and music and how some of the music echoes and whatnot. It definitely took me back to a place of joy.
Thank you.
I think that's a great thing to raise, that these are very pleasurable things to watch, you know, despite all the complications and challenges. We're happily lost in them.
Hi, I was the one who wooed at Wisconsin. I'm Stockbridge Muncie, but my cousins are Ho-Chunk, so it's always like nice to see some Midwestern Native representation. But I wanted to bring up, speaking of the cinematography, that it's very striking, like the kind of very old-timey kind of Super 8 style of camera. It reminds me of the Brian Eno quote that I'm going to butcher, but it's something about as soon as something can be avoided, then it is emulated in art. So I was wondering, like, what's your, why did you kind of go with that, like, Super 8 style camera, and like, what's your process for that?
I mean, it was like a Bolex that I was shooting on, so it was like 16. I think it was just like part of the compression of the video that made it look more grainy or distorted. But the very first film that actually is kind of funny seeing them back to back, but the very first film that I shot on 16 was Lore, and the very second one that I made was Kicking the Clouds. And like with Lore, I mean, part of it was my friend Fern, he's a filmmaker, and he shoots primarily on 16. And, you know, like we were hanging out, and it was just like, I have an amazing shooter here, and so teach me how to shoot a Bolex, you know? And I don't know, I mean, I think probably having gone to grad school in an experimental film program, and as a filmmaker that shot digital primarily, I was always just like talking shit to the filmmakers, like, I mean, I don't know, film's dead, come on, who cares? Shoot digital, give me some artifacts, you know? Joking, of course, but it's just like, you know, part of that sort of like, you know, seeing people really invested in 16 in my cohort made me, you know, feel good about investing in digital as a medium and what that represents and thinking about that more critically. And also just like, you know, it's a lot cheaper, you know, just like to have like a camera that's mine that's like, you know, Canon D60, 60D. And so just like, you know, having a solid relationship with that, there was a point where I wanted to sort of look at a camera differently or look through a camera differently, and the Bolex just seemed like something that was fun, you know? And so part of it was just out of like joy of just wanting to shoot on film and see what it feels like. And like with Kicking the Clouds, I think it was just kind of that continuation of that sort of process. I started shooting it in March of 2021. So just like vaccinated, you know, just like went home for the first time after a long time away. And it just was, there was something about carrying this camera around and having this film and shooting my hometown, which I haven't really shot before in film. It wasn't so much about the nostalgia of it. I think it was just like the process of having a sort of different relationship with the camera and cinematography that felt important. And it's like a knowing too, it's just like working with archival material, like the tape, that there were gonna be connections to archive and just like sort of what 16 offers as an archival format, but then also just in terms of nostalgic sort of relationships to film and sort of ideas of what's outdated or not. But even like in the last 10 years, the conversations around is film gonna die has changed a lot. I mean, it's a lot more expensive now, but it's also like, I think a lot more people are shooting on it. And I don't know, with a lot of things, I'm interested in how to make things unspectacular, you know? And so I just wanted to be like, you know, I just happened to shoot this film on film, you know? And it's a choice that has to do with aesthetics. I like how it looks. And yeah, I like the different way that it makes me think about sort of the process.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, well, first of all, I wanted to like thank you for this evening and watching these films, because it's brought me so much relief, honestly, both as like a native filmmaker and an experimental filmmaker, and a lot of excitement actually. But I wanted to ask you kind of if you had any guidance or anything that you could speak to on your journey and your path of making experimental cinema. And I mean, obviously you just mentioned that you went to grad school, but outside of academia, are there any things that you would offer or say have helped you kind of, because it is complicated to make experimental cinema and to fund it and to stay the course when you have more like broad, complex ideas than like traditional narrative cinema. So I don't know if you had anything to speak to that.
I mean, yeah, a lot. I mean, even just like talking to other friends that are experimental filmmakers, you know, in general, it's like, it's very unique in the US compared to like in Europe or even in Canada, you know, where there's a lot more funding and support. And I had a friend, like Fern, who was talking about being in Europe and talking to filmmakers, and they're just like blown away that he shoots, edits, does his own sound, does everything by himself, because they have like, you know, $100,000 budgets to like, you know, make art films, you know? And so it's just, there's something very unique about, I think, being an American experimental filmmaker that kind of draws on this sort of tradition of I think, something broader in general of like, of what it means to make artist films. And I think really leaning into that was really important for me. Like, I went to grad school and I had no idea what experimental film was, you know? Just, like, I'd made some weird films and applied and got in, and when I got there, it was like, oh, what is this? What are you doing? And that was a bit challenging because it felt gatekeepy, you know? It felt like, you know, oh, here's other students that have been, like, studying experimental film for the last, like, 10 years of their life, you know? And, like, I'm like, who's James Benning, you know? And it just, like, it was like, you know, it was very much like a learning process, but one that I really felt that the tools of experimental cinema as a form, as a tradition, as a sort of idea, sort of like demystified cinema in a way that I could then think about how those could be applied to my own work. And also just like having my own camera, my own microphone, my own sound recorder was freeing because like the Sundance Native Lab was rejecting me, you know, because I wasn't writing these bad scripts, but it's just like, you know, realizing like, they're like, right, this isn't for me, you know? And it just, I remember like trying to like explain a project that I was trying to make, and it was this weird experimental film, and everyone was just like, what? That sounds like a terrible idea. And I was just like, God damn it, you know? But like, just like, well, what I have to do is go make the film, you know? And make the film be the sort of proof of concept, or just a continuing idea of like how to prove the things that I want to say and what I want to make. And I think that was like really important too, of just like not having a lack of budget get in the way. I mean, especially it's now easier than ever to shoot 24 frames per second on your phone, you know, and with ProRes at that. And I think a big part of just like fostering the sort of continued aspect of that is just finding a sense of community. And we're like, when I first started out, like, you go to festivals and everyone's always like, oh yeah, you should be this other Native filmmaker. And it's always Adam Khalil, you know? And it's just like, everyone, like, we were the two people that were making experimental films, you know, him and his brother Zach. And everyone was like, oh, you should meet each other. And so we finally did, you know? And it's just the thing that was really important about that was just like, one, finding other Native filmmakers that are interested in more expanded forms of cinema other than like, you know, narrative and documentary. And really fostering a community where it's not competitive, you know? I mean, it's just like, I remember like being in so many different spaces with Native people where just like there's one person that just wants to be the token and just like, we'll just like talk shit, you know? And it's just like that sort of lateral oppression is really not conductive for really having a collective voice or really kind of building on these different ideas. And I don't know, I think like the more that you can find that in terms of just like fostering your own voice as an experimental filmmaker, as a Native filmmaker, and really just like not letting some of the baggage of experimental film affect you, you know? I always think about that with music. Everyone's always like, don't you put music in films? It's cheesy, but I like it, you know? And it's just like, I'm gonna do it. And it's kind of like why I made like a sing-along song video in this one, because I just, you know, was like, might as well do that, you know?
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, I just, there was so much to enjoy and learn, and so much freedom that seemed, or opening up language a lot in your movies. And I wondered, so I had sort of there seemed to be the idea of connectivity, like you had talked about presentness, and I had a sort of feeling of everything being sort of connected, the past, the present, the future, a kind of, yeah, not distinguishing so much. And the first film, you said something, I don't remember the exact phrase, but it was at the edge of the ocean, something about the opening of the world or a crack. And I was curious about if you would feel comfortable sharing, if that's something that comes from, that you learned from the part of your family that lives in Southern California, certain thoughts about the ocean or about what one connects to at the ocean.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, a text from the Island Waits, which is sort of like a piece of writing that I did that was for a 2-channel video. And that comes from like Ho-Chunk sort of belief systems around like there being 4 water serpents at the corners, like our 4 directions, and that keeps the world from spinning chaotically. It's part of our creation story, or one of the many creation stories. And so it's like that's kind of like what it draws from. I mean, I think it's like the broader sort of thing too I'm interested in is myth, and the way that myths function in a contemporary sort of setting, and also how to remove myths from sort of anthropologists, from these books that were written 100 years ago. And it's just like, how then can, we continue this practice of making myths, of seeing how the context of how they exist today with us is just as relevant as they were 100 years ago. And that also resists different ideas of essentialization, Like, the most authentic version of a Ho-Chunk person didn't exist 100 years ago, It's a constant evolving thing. And one of the things that's really important to push against is just that sort of like assumption, and just resist any sort of essentialized ideas around who we are. And so for me, myth is one of those avenues that I try to explore that, and just sort of these references that I make when it comes to our own belief systems. Whereas, it isn't me referencing a book that I read, blah, 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 or whatever, but rather just like I'm engaging with these things that I believe, and these things that my family believes, and these things that are important to how I understand the world and navigate it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for all of this. Acquiescence to celluloid aside, looking back at, the last decade, what has changed? What's been the biggest change for you? What is the turn that you've experienced, or the hinge on which you evolve as an artist?
I don't feel like the only one. It's just like, even to the earlier question too, I just remember knowing it was like 2013, 14, 15, whatever. I'm just like, I'm not the only Native person that is making experimental work or thinking about these things. Where are they? Just like, how do I find them? And I think just like seeing more and more people, or just like finding each other, people who have been asking these same questions in different ways, has been really important for a sense of feeling sustainable. A group of friends and I always started this collective called Cousin Collective, part of a reason to just like try and support Indigenous experimental filmmakers. And I was at a festival in January, and there was a lot of us like hanging out there, and that felt like really good. I remember my first time at Sundance, and it was just like, I was by myself, sleeping on the couch of someone's, place, and here it's just like, there's 6 or 7 different experimental filmmakers like hanging out, And it's just like, we weren't trying to go to some party, we were trying to hang out with each other. And like, that's really important in a lot of ways, Like, no one wants to feel like the only person that is doing something, even if you know that you're not alone. That's how it can feel sometimes. And I feel like that's like one of the things that I felt has like changed the most in the last like 10 years, is this sort of idea, or this feeling of connectivity, Not to be a cornball or anything, but it just feels like, like it's, that feels palpable. And it's exciting to see what people are doing with cameras, conversations people are having with their own sort of beliefs, with their own sort of relationship to the land, to the language, to being, to identity, to indigeneity, And it's just like, that's the conversations that I want to be part of and be having, It's like, yeah, I can give a history lesson in the Q&A, it's fun sometimes, but it's also like, fun to engage in some of these conversations that are really pushing the sort of boundaries of like what I'm thinking about, or just like thinking about the world in different ways that I hadn't thought about, And I think that's like what's really exciting. Or just how I think about things have changed in the last 10 years.
I was really drawn to one of the things you were speaking about earlier, about how you choose to direct an audience's attention and call things out. Do you think that there's a relationship between the personal documentation that you're doing in your work versus the documentation of a collective, communal experience that involves the present and the history? Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's actually a film that I made in 2017 called Dislocation Blues, and it was about Standing Rock and my time there. And I don't know, I feel like, I mean, it's part of it is formal sort of ways that I think about it. Like, I didn't really do any abstractions in that film because there's people. And I thought more about having them at a distance, you know? Just, I didn't want to film the Camus Fernando Chetti because it's just like, these are people's homes. And it's just like, how then do those ethics sort of mark the way that I make these films that not only account for my presence, but also the presence of others. And it's one thing to abstract the landscape or my friend walking down a hall, because it feels like more, you know, is a sort of conversation that I'm having with these different locations. But once there are people involved, and I feel more about that being part of a conversation with people that I think like shapes the way that the work is done, and or different ways to approach people with a camera, or even like editing, that's I think is important. And so it's just like how then can, you know, those different avenues or different ways of being present with the camera, being held accountable by the camera that you're holding, be felt through the work. And I mean, a lot of the things that I do are with editing because I want my hand to be felt, that I'm the person making these decisions, and I'm very subjective to my own experiences, my own biases, and I'm not an authoritative figure on all things Ho-Chunk, all things Native, and I'm not going to make anything specific or general as a form of education about something like Standing Rock or something about Ho-Chunk mythology. I mean, I think with that Standing Rock film is very much like, this is an imperfect and incomplete documentary. It's a film that's not gonna make you go mini Wachoni, you know, and like check in on Facebook, you know, like all these different things around the conversation about being present and about like being supportive, you know. It's just like, this is a film about processing. And I think just like when something broad and specific like that, when it comes to like filming people is present, then how then does specificity really, I don't know, how does that allow you to account for all these other things that you're thinking about? You know, not trying to answer all the questions about Standing Rock or all the questions about Ho-Chunk belief systems or POWs or whatever, but specificity can be a way in to engage with that where maybe sometimes abstraction fails or, yeah, I don't know.
First, I just want to say thank you and congratulations on such a wonderful body of work and the way your work has evolved over the years. Every time I go to a screening, I ask you, maybe I'm not going to ask you this time, I'm going to say you've successfully decolonized the landscape over and over again. But what I really wanted to ask you about is about 10 years ago, when you had your first screening at Red Cat, it was probably more than 10 years ago. No, it wasn't, okay. I asked you if I could have access to the passwords, to links to your works and your passwords so I could show my students. And you emailed me that there were no passwords, which is like unheard of if you're showing in festival circuit. You have to have passwords. And I've wondered all this time if that was a political gesture in your relationship to ownership, that your work was completely open and available.
I mean, political seems a bit generous. I don't know, I feel like, I mean, maybe it's a bit selfish, maybe, like, just like, I mean, I want people to watch the work and I want people to show it, you know? And it's just like, I don't know, maybe is that, it's always, I mean, as an educator, it's always frustrating when you just can't track down the thing that you want your students to see because it's going to blow their minds, you know? Or because it helps illustrate a point that's like really complicated and just like something that, you know, is, you just want them to see and share. And I don't know, it's just like, I mean, it's flattering when people want to show work in class or just want to watch it, and so just you can watch it. And I don't know, I mean, I just like think about the sort of like barriers that are in place, like I mentioned earlier with like festivals, you know, or screenings, or, you know, gallery spaces and museums, you know, who has access to this? And it's just like, I don't want to live in such a bubble where I think that anyone that wants to see the film is gonna, you know, should come to the screening, you know? It's just like maybe they're in a place where they can't get to. It's like 5 hours away, it's 10 hours away, it's, you know, and so it's just also easier than answering emails too. we're done.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, Sky Hopinka.